Curricula can implicitly communicate what computer scientists do. How? Well, the paper titled Examining Early Elementary Computer Science Identity Repertoires Within a Curriculum, Implications for Epistemologically Pluralistic Identities. And this paper was written by Richard and Kayumova. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, as computer science, CS, enters an increasing number of elementary classrooms, researchers must investigate the representations of what kinds of people are presented as doing computer science within CS curricula. In this paper, we explore a widely used, freely accessible, web-based early elementary CS curriculum to examine the kinds of identity repertoires, behaviors, actions, skills, and socioemotional norms that are promoted as a representative of being, becoming a CS person. More specifically, we draw on identity studies and employ critical discourse analysis to examine how the kinds of norms and repertoires of CS practice made available in the curricular materials might construct a particular account of experiences as representative of being and enacting identities in computer science, and in doing so, produce certain accounts of who a CS person is. Our analysis shows that the curricular materials may construct an identity of a computer science person as someone who is able to solve a puzzle correctly, persist through challenges, connect to their feelings, and work with peers. While this curriculum promotes skills, norms, and repertoires of CS practice aligned with state standards, our findings suggest that it does not appear to present varied and flexible notion of what it means to engage in or become a CS person, end quote. Now you can find a direct link to this paper at jaredoleary.com, or you can simply click the link in the app that you're listening to this on, and it'll take you to the show notes directly for this paper. Now, before we begin with the introduction of this paper, I just want to say that this podcast is a podcast that explores computer science education across all grade levels, and it's either an interview with a guest or multiple guests, or a solo episode like this where I unpack some scholarship and try and relate it to practices in computer science education. Now, my name is Jared O'Leary, and I have worked with every grade, kindergarten through doctoral students, so I've seen a variety of contexts, and we'll try and talk about how you might apply some of these understandings in the various papers that I unpack in relation to different contexts in K-12 or in higher education settings. All right, so in the introduction of this paper, the authors talk about how computer science is a relatively new field for many teachers, many educators, like including myself. My background's in music education before I switched over into computer science education. And this makes it so that many new to CS teachers are having to rely on curricula to figure out some different pedagogical approaches for computer science. So not only is it the content knowledge that teachers are learning, but also the pedagogies involved with how to teach different ideas or concepts, practices, understandings, etc. Now, I mentioned this in other podcast episodes that the type of curriculum that you're using will kind of represent different things. So it might represent who is able to engage in computer science or what a computer scientist actually does. So here's a quote from page 2. Quote, who or what kinds of people are represented as doing CS within the curricular context? What ways of knowing and being, norms, and repertoires of CS practice are promoted as legitimate within the curricular texts? As Walkerdine argues, practices within the text itself have relational effects that define who and what we are. Power operates through discursive constructions of the text by creating boundaries, inclusions, and exclusions about what is considered to be legitimate repertoires of CS practice and what is not. As Wortham highlights, the types of people and the types of learning experiences presented in the discourses of a curriculum have the power to strongly affect the construction of students' identities. Such questions about children's identity development regarding CS can be seen in a growing field of research focused on youth identity development in STEM. As Eisenhart and Allen emphasize, STEM learning environments, teaching practices, and constructed narratives have the power to both expand notions of what CS is and broaden or constrain notions of who can do CS. Therefore, through the discourses presented or omitted within a curriculum, educational settings can define what kinds of people or identities can gain legitimate access to CS, end quote. So I've talked about this in other episodes on curriculum and like integration and whatnot, which I link to in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. Curricula can have a profound impact on what people consider to be normal within a field, both in terms of who is in the field and what those people end up doing. So for example, if we engaged in a computer science class and the only thing you did is programming, then a student might walk away from that and go, oh, computer science means programming. And it might ignore cybersecurity, it might ignore networking, might ignore data analysis, all sorts of other things if those are not also discussed. That may or may not be a bad thing depending on the end goals of what you want a student to walk away with, whether you're working with them for a semester or for like 12 years or however long you happen to be working with them, depending on your teaching context. But the point is, what is taught and what is explored or expressed within a classroom is often very different than the entire realm that can be done, also known as the null curriculum. The null curriculum is what is not taught inside of a classroom. When it comes to computer science, where you focus your attention can have a profound impact on students' identities and ways of being. How? Well, this paper kind of explores that and talks about it. So let's get into this a little bit more. So this paper focuses on two main areas, and this is a quote from page 2. Quote, 1. How, within the discourses of an elementary computer science curriculum, the identity of a CS person is presented, and 2, which, within the discourses of an elementary CS curriculum, identities are shown as participating in CS, or, put in the language of early elementary schoolers, what fills in the blank for young children in the statement, a CS person is someone who, blank. End quote. Now, the course that they happen to be looking at is from co.org, and this is for ages 5 through 8. This is called Course B. So the next main section of this paper is on the conceptual framework and literature review. So the first subsection is an identity within computer science curriculum. So they talk about how computer science curricula and course materials, etc., can have a profound impact on shaping classroom pedagogies, and as well as like student identity and whatnot. Here's an interesting quote from page 3. Quote, woven through these educational resources are discourses that have the power to affirm, maintain, or create new accepted understandings of CS identity through their stated and implied examples of who is / what kind of person's actions and abilities are considered to be doing CS, end quote. And so the authors kind of cite some literature talking about how, historically speaking, CS kind of emphasizes some certain demographics and ways of being more than others. If you're interested in learning more about that in a similar domain in maker culture, check out podcast 18, which is the episode titled Making Through the Lens of Culture and Power, toward transformative visions for educational equity. It's a really important paper that kind of like discusses some of the things that are mentioned here. In fact, the authors of this paper are citing that paper. The next subsection in this area talks about critical discourse analysis. And so the authors actually cite it's a variety of people that I have studied, like Fairclough, G, etc. Like G, I actually took a discourse analysis course from. So critical discourse analysis kind of unpacks language, discourse, text, whatever. There's many different ways of doing this to kind of better understand some kind of a topic, phenomena, etc. There's a variety of approaches to discourse analysis, whether it's critical discourse analysis. There's also, like I did corpus assisted discourse analysis for my dissertation, which is more catered towards looking at a large corpora. So I looked at 11 million words of data and then found patterns and then conducted a discourse analysis on those patterns of that data. But then there's even discourse analysis that can be done on like body language. It's a really fascinating field that is often not discussed when people think of research. They think of qualitative research and quantitative research. But what about corpus-assisted discourse analysis? Which is it? Is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? Like, it's not really clear. Critical discourse analysis I kind of view as more of a separate entity from those two main categories. It probably closer aligns to qualitative research than it does quantitative, but it really depends on what kind of discourse analysis you're doing. If you want to learn more about it, I highly recommend checking out this little subsection or reading the methodology section of my dissertation, which can be found in the publication section on my website. And yes, the dissertation is free, so I'm not trying to sell you anything. I will leave you with one more quote from page 4. This kind of summarizes this section. So, quote, the discourses found in educational resources construct and present subjectivities, specific perspectives, convictions, and beliefs around social, political, and economic relations of power and knowledge. To students, and critical discourse analysis is a useful tool in revealing these subjectivities and finding meaningful relationships between these resources and social practices. Now, the next main section is on the framework and methodology. So they talk about how they tried to select different curricular materials. And so they looked mainly at co.org and Scratch Junior, and they ultimately decided to go with co.org. And they explain why in that section. And then they talk about, well, how did they do critical discourse analysis? So if you want to learn more about that, take a look at that. I don't think that's necessarily interesting for this particular audience, although I am a nerd and enjoyed reading through this because, again, I like discourse analysis. I think it's a fascinating way to look at different things in society. And I actually highly recommend that the field of computer science education actually explore discourse analysis techniques some more, because there's a lot of really cool things that can be done related to equity work and unpacking like oppression and how we might improve things for different identities, marginalized groups, etc. So if you haven't taken a look at discourse analysis, do some investigation, learn some more about it. I include a ton of links in my dissertation, which again is available for free in the publication section or linked in the show notes. Just go to chapter 3, which is the methodology section. The next section is the findings. So here are the 4 main themes that can be found. This is from page 5. Quote, 1. A CS person is someone who is able to solve a puzzle correctly. 2. A CS person is someone who persists through challenges. 3. A CS person is someone who is connected to their feelings. 4. A CS person is someone who works verbally with peers, end quote. Now, that may sound great, but it also can be problematized. Again, this is critical discourse analysis, not just discourse analysis. We're trying to critique things and really kind of understand some of the potential downsides to discourse. So the first subsection under the findings is on a computer science person is someone who is able to solve a puzzle correctly. So the authors talk about how this curricular unit basically leads students down a path where they are solving a series of puzzles that kind of increase in complexity from very simple to more complex, depending on what is being introduced in that particular unit. Now, the puzzles have one correct answer in order to solve it. And the lesson plans and the curricular materials really emphasize the correct nature of solving these puzzles. So if you solve a puzzle in a way that uses more blocks than you should, then that is considered to be incorrect. And so it will ask you to redo this. So that way you can solve it correctly. And that's with like air quotes on correctly. Here's a quote from page 6. Quote, statements like this in the curriculum appear to normalize a technocentric view of a CS person as someone who solves problems in a way that is devoid of significant variation in order to be correct, end quote. You might be like, okay, well, that sounds fine. Like, don't we want students to be able to solve problems? Yeah, I agree. We should. But here's a quote from page 7 that we might need to consider. Quote, these puzzles might not be culturally relevant to some students' lives. Within Co.org's Course B, when students are asked to complete puzzles that included people, they were focusing largely on agricultural or rural themes. Asking students to create loops to harvest corn, to create a program to draw a garden, or to mine stones with as few blocks as possible. These types of activities do not make a connection to the lives of students living in non-rural or non-agricultural areas and make no effort to connect to others' interests of students to give them agency or opportunity to see themselves as CS people, end quote. Now, if you listen to episode 150, which is titled Fostering Intersectional Identities Through Rhizomatic Learning, you'll learn more about how John Stapleton and I kind of conceive of curriculum as an opportunity to engage in hyper-local and hyper-individualized explorations of a domain. In this case, in computer science, rather than making it so that everybody is solving the same puzzle in the same way, what we encourage is creating projects or experiences or opportunities for expression that are individualized to each student. While some students might be interested in this like rural or agricultural content, other students might not. So we need to give students the opportunity to explore variegated interests. And if you want to learn more about that, again, check out episode 150, which I do link to in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. But I guess a main point from the authors might be that, okay, well, solving problems is not inherently a bad thing, but it's the kind of problems that are being solved. If everybody's solving the same kind of a problem, as opposed to people getting to choose what kind of problems they solve that might actually be relevant to themselves or the communities that they live in, those are two very different things. So on the surface, it might be cool that students are learning to problem solve, but if we look at how they are doing that, it might not be. It depends on the goals of yourself as an educator or the students that you are working with. All right, so the second main finding in this section, a computer science person is someone who persists through challenges. Interestingly, the authors note that it's one of the few words that students actually have to like verbally restate. So in the lesson plans, the students are asked to learn how to say the word persistence. And the authors note that the lessons like frequently bring this word up. While this might not be a bad thing to have persistence, it's again going back to the null curriculum, what other words are not being emphasized or what other ways of being are not being emphasized. But I'll unpack that a little bit more later in this episode. So the next theme is a computer science person is someone who is connected to their feelings. So the authors note that this curricular unit and the lessons are frequently asking kids to kind of like notice, reflect on, examine, and share their feelings throughout the processes. So as an example, on page 10, they have a screenshot of the feeling faces, which have like different, basically like little smiley faces and a word underneath it. So the words are, these are the different feelings that you can select from, are great, good, okay, bad, sad, angry, frustrated, and confused. Now the authors note that frustration is a feeling that is frequently brought up in the curricular units itself. So here's an interesting quote from page 9. This is a really good point. Quote, the absence of attention to other emotions within the curriculum solidifies a single dominant narrative of frustrated CS people within this curriculum. Other feelings that can be associated with CS, such as excitement, joy, or pride, are not mentioned in this text, introduced by the teacher, nor shown as feeling faces, end quote. A little bit further down, quote, thus a student who feels frustration while coding is doing CS, but does not acknowledge students who find joy or excitement in the creating and doing of coding, end quote. That's a really interesting point. Now, I had a professor in a curriculum class who was talking about assessment and how that is interesting that we don't actually assess whether or not students enjoy the content that they are learning or the experiences that they are engaging in. And that this is like really telling of the things that we are focusing on. So the author is bringing up that, hey, joy and excitement is not a part of the feeling phases. Well, that kind of like narrows the scope of ways that students can express themselves or kind of see themselves as computer scientists. Now, I will say, as a practitioner, one really quick way that you can kind of get around this limitation or this like narrow scope is just simply say, what other feelings might you be experiencing that are not on the feeling faces card that you have? So a student might be able to draw their own emoji face, or they might be able to just verbally say, I feel happy, or I feel great, or I feel bored, or whatever the emotion is that might not be on the cards that they are using. So my point is, like, yes, this is an interesting point, but we don't have to be limited by the choices that are given. Now, the last theme that they uncover is that a computer science person is someone who verbally works with peers. Now, having worked on standards and like used them a lot in the lesson plans that I've written or in developing standards, like there are often one or more standards that are related to communicating and collaborating around computing. So whether you're communicating the things that you worked on to other people or you are in collaboration with people who are working on similar projects or the same project, most standards have that somewhere written in them. So not only does this curriculum emphasize that, but it might also be influenced by like the layer above, which are the standards that often influence the curriculum that is then being taught in the classroom, which then impacts what students learn within the classroom. And again, I talk about this more in some of the podcast episodes on curriculum integration and how there are different layers of curriculum that we can look at. For example, there's the intended curriculum, there's the taught curriculum, there's the experienced curriculum, there is the null curriculum, the hidden curriculum. Like there's many different layers that you can get into if you want to nerd out on curricular theory. So check out episode 123, the subservient, co-equal, effective, and social integration styles and their implications for computer science. Or check out episode 125, images of curriculum, or episode 126, contemporary venues of curriculum inquiry. All three of those are really interesting ways that you can consider curricula and curriculum integration. And again, I link to all of them in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. Now, one of the other things that is really interesting that they point out is that the curriculum really emphasizes collaboration with peers. So asking a peer for help rather than asking a teacher. On one hand, this makes it really easy for the teacher, so that way they're not having to respond to every single question that might come up. So that's kind of like just generally makes life easier. But another way that you can look at that from a more critical view is that it makes it so that the teacher doesn't really need to know much to be able to solve these particular problems. Computer science curricula is often criticized as like leaving the teacher out of things and making so that it's like, oh, look, you don't even need a teacher. You can just hire a paraprofessional at like half the cost, and then they can run your computer science class. Well, yeah, that might be true, depending on how you design the curriculum. It really takes away the ability to adjust things individually for students because instead they're just following a curriculum like online, and it's just that may or may not actually relate to students' interests. But if you do have somebody who is an expert in content area and expert in pedagogy, once both of those things are combined, then they can actually customize the learning experiences to each individual, which again, I talk about in other episodes. And the authors end this section by saying that, hey, this kind of can create a problem if students aren't able to communicate in their own languages. So it reinforces dominant language, and then it can also have a negative impact on students with some disabilities. If you want to learn more about that, make sure you check out this section in the paper. All right, so the next section of this paper is the discussion section. Here's a quote from page 11. Quote, our analysis shows that the repertoires of CS practice and the kinds of CS identities constructed and produced through activities, behaviors, and representations in Code.org's Course B curricular materials present a somewhat narrow conception of the CS person. Someone who collaborates in the dominant language, persists through frustration while feeling little joy or pride in their work, and is able to correctly solve a puzzle in the same way as their peers, end quote. And the word correctly is in air quotes. Now, again, you might be like, well, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Well, they kind of unpack some of the perceived problems with this. So here's a quote again from page 11. Quote, as Vasogi et al. Argue, if teachers respond to students' frustration with an instance that students persist, then teachers forfeit the opportunity to interpret these moments as an indication of what needs pedagogical attention or curricular change. The broader context of educational injustice, therefore, has consequences for how practices such as iteration are conceptualized and mediated, end quote. And a little bit further down on the same page, quote, by valuing only one preferred form of CS practice or expression, one which signals a particular form of a repertoire of CS practice, As a representative measure of learners' CS engagement and identity, this curriculum does not make space for a pluralistic understanding of CS knowledge and coding, end quote. And pluralistic epistemologies and whatnot, that is something from Turkle and Papert. If you want to learn more about that, is a link to that paper in the publication itself, in the references. But these are some really interesting points that resonates with me. Again, going back to that paper that I talked about with fostering intersectional identities that I collaborated with John Stapleton on, we really emphasize the importance of hyper-local educational experiences where students are able to go in whatever direction they'd like to explore through with guidance from peers, from teachers, from resources, etc. But they ultimately choose where they are going, what they are working on, and the paths they take to get there. This is very different than what you can do with a curriculum where everybody is solving the same puzzle in the same way. By emphasizing frustration on one hand, from a curriculum development standpoint, it might be useful for teachers who are brand new to go, oh, this is expected that students are going to get frustrated. This isn't just going to be sunshine and rainbows the entire time they're working on this curricular unit. But on the other hand, it's a really important point that teachers and students are unable to modify the puzzles that they are exploring or the problems they are trying to solve to match the frustration level or the ability level of students who are working on the computer science projects, or puzzles rather. So in the final section, the conclusion, the authors basically end by saying, hey, we need to have more epistemologically pluralistic identities. And again, this is citing Turkle and Papert, so you can read more about this if you're interested in that. Maybe I'll actually read that particular paper and do an unpacking scholarship episode down the road. Stay tuned. But here's a quote that I want to leave you with on page 12. Quote, if the curriculum asks for teachers to privilege dominant Eurocentric repertoires of CS practice as the only legitimate act of doing of computer science, we run the risk of devaluing the diverse and complex ways of doing, being, and knowing that are present in our classrooms, end quote. That's a great quote. I love it. And it actually leads into the next section, which at these unpacking scholarship episodes, I like to talk about some lingering questions and thoughts that I have when reading a paper. So the first question that I have is, if researchers were to analyze the discourse you use when teaching, what themes might emerge? And I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I mean, you could actually do this. I've done it myself, where I would go back and look at the transcript of a lesson that I taught and then be like, oh wow, I really focus on this thing, or I really talk about this thing in a very specific way, and kind of unpack some of the things that are intentionally or unintentionally left out and problematize, should those things have been in there? Whether it be different practices or different identities or whatever. But a follow-up question to that might be, how might that compare or contrast with your own philosophy of education? So one of the things that you might realize if you were to analyze your own teaching is that your own understanding of education and your philosophy behind that might not necessarily align with the things you are doing. Instead, what you might be doing is how you were taught, both the good and bad things. Sometimes I'd realize that when a student was like, oh, I don't want to do this thing, and I'd sit back and look at it and go, well, why am I making them do that? I go, oh wait, that doesn't actually align with the educational philosophy that I have. It actually aligns with just what I am used to and what I know. It's not necessarily a bad thing. That kind of makes it easier from an educator standpoint, but from a student standpoint, it's not very interesting. So my educational philosophy centers around student individualized interest and happen to be teaching one-on-one in a group context, which I often describe as facilitating. If you want to learn more about that, check out the podcasts that are tagged with interest-driven learning, which I will link to in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. Now, another question that I have that I think would be interesting to actually explore is, how might the curriculum developers respond to this article? So as a former curriculum developer and a former classroom educator, I can say that I understand the perspectives of the authors, totally makes sense, but I also understand that there are so many things that are intentionally designed into or left out of curriculum that people who are reading it might not understand. So from a curriculum development standpoint, what context could the developers provide, or things might they elaborate on that the authors missed? It truly is fascinating at times, having developed hundreds of lessons that have been used by tens of thousands of teachers around the world. The amount of times that I've actually walked into a classroom or a conference session where somebody is teaching a lesson that I wrote and seeing them teach it in a way that I really wouldn't do myself and tried to not encourage in the lesson itself, but they're doing it that way anyways. So even though I tried to overemphasize interest-driven learning, I've seen people teach some of my lessons in a very rote way where everybody recreates the exact same project that I demonstrated in a video, even though I will explicitly say, make your own version of this. How would you change it, etc. So maybe the author has missed something. But another way of looking at it is thinking of how the curriculum developers might have been catering this to a very specific targeted audience. And the audience of code.org at that grade level most likely are educators who have not taught computer science before. So how much of this was trying to help those teachers understand what it looks like when a student so-called succeeds in a computer science class or in a problem, etc. I say this because new to CS teachers often go, well, I don't know what it means to be a successful computer science student. And that's very fair judgment. That's really good reflection. So maybe the developers are trying to hold the hand a little bit more than they might have for teachers who have been teaching computer science for quite some time. But I don't know. Another question that I have related to that is, what other themes would you add? So if you were to look at code.org's curriculum, what other themes might the authors have missed or that you might elaborate on or add to? For example, some curricula could emphasize that computer science is something kids can learn, but only if taught by a computer science expert outside of the classroom. Or maybe a theme that students might learn is that computer science is something that everybody does at the same pace to solve or recreate the same solution to the same problem. Or that computer science isn't used to solve problems relevant to the learner or the community that they live in, or simply that computer science solves small problems that exist in isolation from a web of interconnected problems. These are all other themes that might emerge from looking at the same curriculum, or just like expanding beyond code.org. So not trying to bash on them, there's some fantastic people who work there, but just puzzle-based platforms in general that are focused on problem-based learning might have all of those themes and more. But the last thought that I have kind of builds off of that. So I think a big part of the critique is inherent in the epistemological underpinnings of the curriculum itself. So the curriculum for code.org at that grade level is, from an outside perspective, is designed to make it easy for a teacher to get started, not to teach the teacher how to collaboratively develop individually meaningful projects with students. That's a very different approach. So such an approach takes a lot of time for teachers, and it's just completely different design for the curricular materials themselves than what is evident on code.org's website. Again, I don't say this as a critique, as it has helped many people get started with computer science education, but to point out that this curriculum serves an important purpose, despite the critique that I agree with that the authors do make. So I present a critique and a very useful tool and say that they both are one and the same. Code.org has some great stuff in it, some great content, but as with any curriculum, there's things that are left out of it. The more you try and fine tune whatever it is that you're crafting into your curricular content and make it more of a one size fits all, the less likely it's going to be useful to everybody that you're working with. I know that there are a lot of really well-intentioned curricular providers that are out there that are doing some different things to try and engage teachers and students, etc. But I will say that a lot of those providers are doing it in a way that tries to make it easier for the teacher. While that sounds great in the short term, what it's really doing is making it so that the teacher is reliant upon the curricular materials developed by outsiders. This makes it so that you cannot create curricular content that is bespoke, that is custom made for each individual that you're working with in your classroom or classes. And it's basically the idea of giving a person a fish rather than teaching a person how to fish. In this case, giving a teacher a lesson plan rather than teaching them how to create a lesson plan with their own content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge and community and individual knowledge of the students that they are working with. That, to me, is the ideal way to kind of craft and create curricular content. I tried to do that in the lesson plans that I previously created. I tried to make it so that here is a model, not a mandate. You can take a look at the project that I made and learn how I did that. Cool. Now do it in your own context. You don't like this project? Fine. There's 30 more that you can pick from to be able to work through on your own at your own pace using the resources that I have developed. It makes it so that it's easy for the teacher to be able to get up and running, but it also encourages the teacher to customize every single project to be able to express themselves, and then to use that to talk to students about how they can customize these projects to make their own unique projects in whatever platform you are doing. You can't really do this with puzzle-based platformers, which is why I personally preferred project-based platforms like Scratch and Scratch Junior. But there's a place for all of these, and depending on whatever your educational goals are or learning goals are as either a teacher or a student. So again, not trying to bash on anyone at code.org or any of the other puzzle-based platformers out there. I understand that there are many ways to engage in education, and I respect them. I just have my own preferences for the courses that I've designed and the classes that I've facilitated and the materials that I've made for different contexts, whether it's computer science education or music education. If you enjoyed this particular episode, please consider sharing with somebody else. You could simply send a text to somebody and say, hey, check out this episode, think you'd enjoy it, or even sharing it on social media. It helps more people find the free computer science drumming, and gaming content on my website, jaredoleary.com. But stay tuned next week for another podcast. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.